Good afternoon and welcome to an Ethical Corporation webinar on transitioning to net positive impact. I'm Ed Long, Project Director at Ethical Corporation. To avoid the worst climate impacts and meet the 2050 net zero emissions horizon, it is estimated global greenhouse gas emissions will need to drop by half in the next 10 years. Companies are being tasked to realign their strategies and operations in line with these goals. But what does that mean in practice? How can businesses realign business models without impacting current success? It's an area that came up a lot during research for this year's Responsible Business Summit Europe. Due to this, we'll be hosting a number of sessions at the event focused on providing new ideas and strategies around driving to such a strategy. As part of the knowledge exchange in the build-up to this year's event, we're excited to host today's webinar with 4 great minds who will share their ideas, strategies, and learnings in how business can deliver a net zero business. Key areas will include target setting. Is the company setting sufficient ambitious targets in the right areas? The role of coalitions in sending demand signals to markets and supporting greater ambition from government. How to get senior stakeholder approval and bring suppliers on the journey. And it's my pleasure to hand over to Terry, the editor at Ethical Corporation, who's going to be getting the discussions underway.
Great, thank you, Ed. So the 4 great minds we have today are Gabrielle Junier, Head of Environmental Sustainability at BT, Aris Retos, Director of Open Programs and International Markets at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, Mike Pierce, Corporate Partnerships Director at the Climate Group, and Christopher Springin, Vice President of Global Communications and Sustainability at LM Wind Power. So as Ed said, I'm the editor of Ethical Corporation, the magazine. We cover, one of the major things we cover in the magazine is how companies are stepping up to the challenge of climate change, not only in their communication, but in their operations. And we've reported very closely on initiatives like the Science Based Targets Initiative, where 685 companies to date have signed up to align their plans to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement to keep global warming under 2 degrees. Now, I was in New York for Climate Week in September, and there we saw 87 companies who committed to align their operations to the 1.5, the very ambitious 1.5 C limit. And they also pledged to reach net zero emissions by 2050. So what's particularly ambitious is that these commitments cover companies' entire value chains, and these account for 5.5 times the emissions in their own operations. So there's also been a lot of collective action, companies signing up to bold commitments on renewable energy, reducing transport emissions, improving energy efficiency, removing deforestation risk. And this is something that I'm sure that we'll be hearing Mike Pierce talk about. But I would first like to turn to Aris to set some of the context for us and ask him if this is going to be enough, if this commitment by those 87 companies, even if they are able to meet the targets that they're setting, if that's going to be enough, if that's ambitious enough. Aris.
Thank you, Terry. Hi everyone. Let me answer. I think it's a difficult question to answer. First of all, I want to say that it does make a difference whether we're looking at 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, and the science is telling us now that the impacts will be significant. For example, the number of extremely hot days would become more severe and common at 2 degrees compared to 1.5 degrees. We know that insects and plants are almost twice as likely to lose half their habitat. There's a big impact on corals, which at 2 degrees might be completely gone. by 2100. And very importantly, the population impacts and the amount of population of people exposed to various stresses, including water, rises dramatically. So it does make a difference to aim towards 1.5 versus 2 degrees. But I guess you can play a little bit with the numbers. The real issue is to try and get to a carbon neutral economy as soon as possible. And that is definitely the direction that's been set by some governments, but a lot of the business community. And particularly, we know that the science tells us global emissions have to fall to net zero as early as possible before the second half of the century, and particularly in developed economies where they have to demonstrate the leadership that to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. So is it important? Yes. Is it significant that those companies are going beyond sort of the science-based targets? Absolutely. It sends strong signals. It's much more aligned with the science, and it is the fact that this includes value chain makes a big statement, regardless of how certain some of those organizations are in terms of achieving how they're going to achieve those targets. It makes it much more straightforward to look at the whole value chain impacts, which is where the majority of those emissions are. Is it the solution to all climate things and challenges? It's hard to say. Probably not. We can't know for certain. What's interesting is the more we learn about the impacts of climate, the more challenging things become. And for example, this would not address issues related to adaptation, for example. We also know that there are things that are not easily measurable that do not fall into a traditional sort of value chain analysis. And we kind of going back to the question that was raised in the beginning of the webinar. Is it possible to realign business models without impacting current success? The reality is that it is possible, but not for everyone. And we also have to start thinking differently about what we mean and how we measure current success. Some business models are easier to realign than others. We live in a very carbon intensive and inefficient economy. If agriculture accounts for a quarter or more of all emissions, and we have 30% or more food waste, there's some things that we really have to tackle there. And instead of trying to mitigate or find energy efficiency solutions to offset, as it were, that maybe there's some more targeted intervention that need to happen. It is difficult when you're looking at the air transport, when you look at the steel sector, the cement section, and so on. These things are not necessarily very easy, but a lot of kind of people are working on this. So we have to look at the different impacts, I think, from each sector and what needs to be done. So, for example, agriculture will have to and land use, moving to low meat diets, vegetarian diets, and changing how food is produced. That's going to make perhaps a more significant impact. And that's probably what those companies will also have in mind when they're setting those ambitious targets for the next couple of decades. The same for transport and energy supply, phasing out coal, and moving to renewables. So each sector will need to look at these things very differently and take actions that are appropriate. Some might need to look at regenerative business models, for example, how the amount of deforestation, hold the amount of land constant, and there are business models that are moving towards that. But I think one of the things that we'll also discuss today is the fact that there are limits to what a single company can do on its own, even within its value chain. And that's why it is important to engage, to build coalitions, to work with others in society, to engage with governments and peers, but also organizations from other sectors to reduce, to start working on how to make our overall economy less carbon intensive from the beginning. And that might include things that are not related directly to climate change, like reducing inequalities, and kind of more socioeconomic areas, improving trust that will then allow us to collaborate better and have stronger institutions that tackle this challenge. So I'll pause here, and I'll look forward to continuing the discussion in some of the more specific details.
Okay, I'll just ask one question before moving on, and that's about carbon pricing, and whether you think that seems to be something that's emerged as a very important component to drive carbon action in companies, and it's something that's going to be discussed at COP, trying to get a framework for carbon pricing. What's your feeling about that?
So I should say I'm not an expert. We have a team here at CISL, at our corporate leaders group, do a lot of the work and have been involved in international, at the COP and the agreements, and at the international stage. But my understanding, particularly from the work that I do with business and people in the wider economy, is that a carbon price, it's an essential and very important tool in the process, but in itself doesn't necessarily solve and doesn't necessarily get us exactly to where we want to get. It's very helpful to send strong signals, but particularly in an age where the cost of money, it remains quite low, in its, there are other considerations that are taken forward. And I guess it also depends. We've had a carbon price at different levels and different rates. It also depends at what level you are setting this. And at present, I think the EU is making some very ambitious noises about what kind of price will create the right incentive. So definitely necessary, but needs other perhaps positive ways, from subsidies to other types of incentives, as well as many other considerations and engagement types to have a real impact in the current economy.
That's great. Thank you very much, Aris. I'm now going to turn to Gabrielle. BT was one of those companies that signed up to the 1.5C targets in New York, and I believe you were actually one of the very first companies globally to do that. Weren't you, Gabrielle?
Yes, that's right, Terry, and thank you. So maybe I just start by talking a bit about BT for those of you that might not be familiar with us. So we are the largest provider of consumer fixed line voice and broadband services in the UK. We're also the UK's largest mobile operator and the second largest pay TV sports broadcaster. We're also a global company, and we serve customers in 180 countries worldwide. We have annual revenues of about 24 billion and over 100,000 employees. Our purpose is to use the power of communications to make a better world, which obviously fits very well with my job as head of environmental sustainability. So at BT, we have been on a climate action journey for over 25 years now. We were one of the first companies in the world to set a carbon reduction target already back in 1992. And we set a science-based target in 2008. And this was before companies were even talking about setting science-based targets. The target that we set at that time was to reduce the carbon emissions intensity of our business by 80% by 2020. And we actually met that target 4 years ahead of target. So we decided to be even more ambitious. And I was coming back from Paris on the Eurostar from COP. And I thought, well, in line with this historic agreement, what does a company like BT need to do to be a leader on climate action? And it was obvious to me at the time, we needed to set a 1.5 degree aligned target, and which is what we announced in September of 2017, and we were one of the first companies in the world to announce that, which was of course already before the publication of the IPCC 1.5 degree target on 1.5 degrees, and why that's so important. Following the publication of that report, we also announced a target to be a net zero emissions business by 2045. And just to talk about a bit around the topic today, so what are things that companies like BT need to do to reach these targets? And for us, it's three things. Firstly, we need to get to a target around 100% renewables globally. We are currently at 100% renewables here in the UK, but we're only at 87% globally, and we need to reach 100%. Secondly, we need to decarbonize our fleet. BT has one of the UK's largest fleets. We have around 30,000 vehicles, and we need for those to become electric vehicles, and to do that we also need electric charging infrastructure around the UK. And a third area where we need to decarbonize is around how we heat our buildings. And really for us to reach these targets, we need to see innovation, and we need to see collaboration between the public and private sector, which I think we'll come back to later in this discussion. But I also wanted to mention the fact that we see carbon and tackling carbon emissions as a revenue opportunity for us. We know from various studies that technology and ICT products and services can help society lower their emissions by becoming smarter and more efficient. And we've seen various studies that show that ICT can enable a 20% reduction of carbon emissions by 2030. And we're seeing this become reality at BT already. We set a target in 2013, which we called our net positive or net good target, which is to help customers reduce their carbon emissions by at least 3 times the end-to-end carbon impact of our business by 2020. And we call that our 3-to-1 target. So what does that actually mean? So in the 3, we add up the carbon savings from products like video conferencing and audio conferencing, things that we're doing today that replace travel, but also things like transport apps. And in the 1, we look at the emissions associated with our own operations, with our supply chain, and with customers using our products and services. And actually last year, we helped our customers save almost 12 million tons of carbon. That's the equivalent of the carbon emissions of nearly 3 million UK households. So when we launched the target, we were at a ratio of just about 1-to-1. We're at a ratio now of 2.6 to 1, and the revenues associated with that portfolio are £5.5 billion, or 23% of BT's total revenues. So that's a bit about our strategy and how we're looking at carbon targets.
So so in terms of not losing revenue as a result of this approach, that looks like you're showing that that's eminently doable. I'm wondering about, you talked about the rollout of your charging infrastructure, and the role of working with the public and private sectors working together. How important is that, do you think, in terms of achieving the climate emergency, how we can globally respond to the climate emergency?
I think that's critical. As we all know, this is a challenge that none of us can solve by ourselves. So, for example, BT will not be able to innovate on car manufacturing because that's not something we do. We will not be able to lay nationwide charging point infrastructure here in the UK. But what we can do is, as a big corporate, we can send a demand signal to the market saying that we have these targets, this is what we're trying to achieve, and hopefully that will encourage other players in the market to innovate and to work with us to reach those targets.
Okay, that's great. We are starting to get some questions in from the audience, but I'm going to wait until we've gone through all our presentations, and then we can deal with those. So our next speaker is Christopher Springin from LM Wind Power. Chris, just wondered. Now I understand that you have gone net zero with your operations.
That's correct. Again, probably useful to share a little bit about LM Wind Power. We are one of the oldest and certainly one of the world's largest manufacturers of wind turbine blades. And the rotor is the motor of a wind turbine. It's the crucial component in catching the wind to power a cleaner world, which is our company vision. We are a labor-intensive, capital-intensive industrial manufacturing business, by contrast with the VT example. We are 15 factories in 8 countries: China, India, Brazil, the United States, and all around Europe, with 15,000 employees. And clearly what we do is intrinsically contributing to a cleaner world, in that we're trying to make wind energy the most affordable form of renewable energy and widely available to all, in line with SDG 7, clean and affordable energy. A little bit of background on our decision to go carbon neutral as a business is that we signed the UN Global Compact in 2010. So like BT, we had a clear vision that this was going to be a responsibility and actually a requirement of business going forward. And then we worked with the Global Reporting Index, applying their reporting standards, and adopted a 4-step program with a clear and defined target to achieve that goal by 2018. First was to map our emissions data globally and properly understand it and profile it and report it in public. I have a very, very strong commitment to public reporting. I believe it both guides, drives, and it also compels the organization to focus on where emissions come from and why. The next step is to reduce our emissions, which we've done throughout our whole industrial footprint. Quite evidently, switching to renewable energy is the next step, because this is a primary source of our emissions. And then finally, and not reluctantly, offset any remaining emissions to ensure that we achieve a carbon neutral status, which we did. And in so doing, we led the wind industry ahead of all our competitors, all our suppliers, and our customers. Now, why would we do that? Well, I actually have a very clear view about the science-based targets, and I want to offer my thanks and commend all those organizations that subscribe to it. I also believe in global targets, although personally 1.5 doesn't get anywhere near where I'm thinking. 0 is the only target. But the real reason why we did what we did when we did is that, like Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, I'll paraphrase his remarks at the European Business Summit. We happen to think that this is a global crisis, it's an immediate crisis, and it's an existential crisis. We share that view with all our employees. And in 2017, when we were acquired by GE Renewable Energy, I'm very proud to say that my colleagues there also shared this view about the future of business and the absolute requirement of business to make a contribution. And they too have committed in public to go carbon neutral by the end of 2020. Finally, I'd like to say how this can truly impact the business beyond the absolute critical necessity of thinking about the planet and the fact we'd like to continue occupying it in years to come. and that's that we made very considerable savings, 2.6 million savings off our bottom line, off our energy bill in 2018 alone. And therefore, we have proved absolutely in clear and in balance sheet terms that a green business is a leaner business and therefore more profitable. And I also fully support Gabrielle's view that this also presents an opportunity to drive our customers towards a greener future. And it is creating opportunities for customers as they begin to see that green energy becomes a more affordable proposition. They find it easier, of course, to achieve a wider installation. So I see it as directly linked to profit, and I find that to be a very positive message for everybody in the group and on the call.
Okay, that's great. I just wanted to ask what carbon neutral means in your context, and how big a role do offsets play in this?
Well, the offsets remain a relatively small proportion of our overall effort. As I mentioned to you, the very first part is to ensure that you understand where your emissions come from. Second is to reduce those emissions, which we did through the energy saving measures, among other things, transport and logistics and some employee travel, and then replace with renewable energy. So the offsets are the last of it, and they can represent as much as a third. I don't know that there's a point which you would say an offset is not a legitimate way to go, because in the end, for me, I mean, they are linked to Kyoto. You can't. There's no way you can reduce all your emissions to absolute zero. There are always unavoidable emissions. We need, for example, to travel to some degree as a global business. But ultimately, my goal would be for us to be fully carbon positive through our supply chain and ultimately through our customer profile as well. And that would be by ensuring that renewable energy is the most affordable way of powering their businesses.
Okay, we'll have some more questions afterwards, but I'd like to now turn to our last speaker, Mike, and ask what Climate Group is doing in this.
Great, thanks Terry, and hello everyone. I suppose let me start by echoing every other speaker here on the point about the urgency and scale of the challenge we face. This is the climate decade. I think to add a tone to that, though, is that it does mean that the bulk of the work has to be started in the first half of the decade if we're going to see the effects of that manifest in the later part of that. And just an example on that, when one looks at the investment cycle for the automotive sector, we do need to see action on the new platforms coming through in the next few years if that's going to make it in time for the end of the internal combustion engine by the end of the decade. At the Climate Group, the contribution we make is to help to signal to national governments that business and indeed other sort of non-state actors, state and regional governments, are showing it's possible to make bold commitments and to transform society. It's vital to focus on the right things, of course, and we've heard some of those already today. At the Climate Group, we picked on 3 of the most critical climate issues: renewable electricity, energy use, and clean transport. And indeed, noting Aris's points, we're starting work looking at some of the heavy emitting sectors such as steel and cement. I think what we've seen over the last few years across our work and indeed others on the We Mean Business Coalition is that there are reasons for optimism. Almost 300 multinational businesses across every major sector have joined the corporate leadership programs that we have in those areas: RE100 on renewables, EP100 on smarter energy use, and EV100. We've, these are significant businesses. We've heard from BT already, members of RE100 and EV100. Collectively, these are companies with operations in 140 markets, 16 million employees, $5.5 trillion in combined revenue. Why are they doing this? Many reasons do emerge from our conversations with them, but underlying that is a recognition of the commercial opportunities. Christopher said just now about the $2 million of financial savings. Our latest report from our EP100 members, they first of all talked about the saving in terms of carbon, and so there's a carbon equivalent of 134 coal-fired power plants in a year. On the money side, though, that equates to $55 million in financial savings from those companies in that year. If we look at the work on renewables, customer expectations on this are becoming increasingly critical. But then we also see in our latest report, we'll talk about this in a few weeks' time, that more than half identified cost savings as a reason for going 100% renewable. And then even on electromobility, where people still often point to the additional upfront costs for the vehicles, you know, there's a real motivation for some companies where there's significant, particularly with high vehicle use, there's already cost savings being generated for those. There's issues around future proofing on policy, for example, around zero emission zones in cities. IKEA talk about $30 million of revenue being retained ahead of new zero emission zones in Amsterdam being installed. This means that they have access to continue the markets. And of course, you know, there's a continued piece there on customer expectations increasingly around that very visible part of the company's action. Just a few sort of note comments just to finish now, which is sort of say, you know, how do those different initiatives actually make a difference? Just sort of looking at one of the areas around renewables, I think first of all, and the starting point of this is they represent, when a company makes 100% commitment to renewable electricity and starts to deliver on that, there is a direct contribution they're making already through their work. And indeed, a third of the companies that have signed up to RE100 are already at 75% renewable already from their work, despite longer term commitments. There's obviously an impact on supply chains. Almost half of the companies in that RE100 list engage suppliers on their renewables, and there are some very actively in doing that and quite significant in the change they've made. And then there's sort of an impact one gets from the collective demand signal. We combine all of those RE100 members, and together that represents the 21st largest electricity user in the world. This is a significant part of the market signal. And then finally, I think the piece here is that we do see that business leadership, and I think particularly at a time of complex, let's put it in terms of complex global governance and global governments, can help to support a policy environment, particularly when that voice comes in strength. And we have seen that by making these commitments across industries and sectors, governments increasingly feeling more comfortable in being able to make their own commitments and provide thereby a supportive environment for business action. And that ambition loop of business and government action, I really think is going to be one of the most significant factors in driving progress on the energy transition over this critical decade.
Thanks, Mike. When you talk about the ambition loop, can you give some examples? Which governments seem to have been bolstered by this? Where do you see that companies have really made an impact?
Yeah, no, that's great to hear that. And I think what's been exciting is that from a sort of like a positive narrative we've had around this, it really has become through some tangible things in the last few years. There's a network we work through in Europe with Wind Power Europe, Solar Power Europe, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And together that group really had a significant part in helping the European Commission to get clarity in their rules for power purchase agreements, so that those companies could increase renewable energy investment. So quite a technical piece of the Commission rule place was influenced there. A number of RE100 companies have scrutinised the draft national energy and climate plans that are submitted by member states, again to make sure they remove barriers to corporate renewable energy sourcing. But lest one think this is sort of just a sort of a Euro story, where we've had some very interesting things in Asia in the last year. South Korea, for example, we've had a number of discussions that the government had with RE100 members, and following that, the government introduced a new certification system, which is helping those companies both to buy and track renewable electricity. And equally, and I think this sort of taps into the one last example, which taps into the supply chain story, is in the Taiwanese market. Authorities there have recognised the importance of the signal of RE100 members, and seeing themselves as a global manufacturing hub, have said, how are we going to, we need to enable our companies to be powered by clean electricity to be able to be viable suppliers in the future for those companies, and are looking there. This is where there hasn't been a significant shift yet in the regulation, but there is a lot of potential there where the government has seen we need to do this to be able to win in global markets.
Fantastic. That's great. I think we can now turn to, we have about 25 minutes left, and we have quite a few questions come in, so maybe we can start looking at some of those. One of them is about energy storage and how big a role will that be in reaching net zero? Perhaps that's a good one for you, Christopher.
Sure. Well, energy storage is becoming an absolutely one of the hottest topics across the whole sector, and actually, interestingly, it interests the fossil community as much as it does the renewables. You know, there are also very many different routes into the technology. One of the most elementary, but nonetheless effective methods for storing energy, particularly energy from renewable sources, is to push water uphill, and that's been applied in a number of locations globally for many years. What we're seeing is obviously the opportunity that comes from renewable businesses where they can link hydro power into their overall picture for energy generation. It's one of the advantages, perhaps competitive advantages, that GE Renewables has. But the other area, and it's self-evident, is battery development. And I have two views on this. I think that the first is that, you know, clearly it's going to be a massive focus and area of investment in research and development technology in the coming years. We've already seen the impacts of it in our personal lives with, for example, extended lifespan of a mobile phone, or the extended duration of an electric vehicle's range. But what really I think is exciting about this, and why we should be really looking positively at the coming decade in the area of energy storage, is the fact that I think there's as much chance of there being a massive breakthrough in this area coming from a small to medium-sized entrepreneurial organization, or even an entrepreneurial organization in conjunction with a university, as there is any huge energy giant coming up with the magic formula and being able to wrap their arms around it and say it's theirs. I also think that it could come from any geography in the world. We've seen some fantastic innovation coming out of India and out of China because we work there so closely. So I'm very encouraged by this, and I do think that ultimately, within a combination of smart grids and storage, there is a clear renewable energy future. We can reach that sooner, and the more we see investment coming towards it, the faster that will go.
That's great, thank you. Question for you, Gabrielle, about your fleet, from Antoine Gontier, who asks, what about the zero carbon, the power that's going to those fleets, and also how the vehicles themselves are constructed, the embedded carbon in the vehicles. So are you working on that?
Yes, and I think that's a very good point about the power for the vehicle. So one of the concerns that we see, and indeed that we are raising, and again, I think that's why working in collaboration is so important, is how are we going to make sure that we have enough renewable electricity to power these vehicles, and also around looking at the network and how energy is transported. So how do we make sure that the renewable electricity is in the places where we need it to be? And on the question about vehicles and I guess the embedded emissions in manufacturing, I know that many of the vehicle manufacturers, such as Renault, Nissan, etc., are all looking into this. I think that's something we are seeing through this collective movement and ambitions towards net zero, that through more and more companies joining, we see changes in that. So that's something, of course, that we push for in discussions with vehicle manufacturers, but I think it's also something that they themselves are looking at in terms of their targets and ambitions.
Okay, I think that's
Terry, Terry, might I just add to what Gabriella said there, which is, I think what's been really helpful and positive is having companies such as BT and others who are, in a sense, taking leadership across a number of these areas and thinking systematically about it, because that enables a very different sort of conversation with, both with the market and with policymakers and indeed with NGOs, to be able to say how we recognise there are some challenges with any of the individual moves that are going on in an area. Let's not ignore those, but let's say, well, let's work through how we are going to make this system work so that it doesn't just become a simplistic thing of just do one thing and ignore the others. Having said that, I think and I'm not the data expert on this, but clearly we've seen is that there is still a positive story around electric vehicles as an alternative to internal combustion engines, even when the energy mix is not a renewable electricity. So there are gains to be made in terms of the pure energy efficiency of the running of those that makes there an upside. That's not to say that we don't want to be able to moving forward on this broader agenda, and really helpful to have companies helping that conversation.
That's great, thanks. I thought you might want to come in on that as well, Mike. So, Christopher, there's a question about your Scope 3 emissions and about obviously you're using steel and I presume plastics in the manufacture of your blades. So where are you getting, and obviously high carbon content, embedded carbon in those. So what are you doing to address that?
Well, first of all, within our scope of our carbon neutrality pledge, we're a carbon neutral business. So we hand over that problem at when the customer picks up the blade. And yes, we do have metals, we have some natural materials, and we do have some plastic materials as component elements within the blade. We have actually, to save anybody wants to look at the detail of this, we publish in great detail all the aspects of this in great detail in our annual sustainability report, so you can find that all online. But the aspect of this is that we take a great responsibility as a manufacturer of the product to lead the industry on considering what the through life aspects of our product are, particularly what options there are for recycling and reuse. We already actually cycle plastic into the blade as a structural element in replacement of balsa, and we're working very hard with industry associations to try to ensure that we come up with solutions which work for them both economically and environmentally. So our scope runs from the emissions we create when our suppliers deliver product to us, and we count everything there, everything we create ourselves with our own energy use and with equipment associated with our manufacturing, and then it stops at the factory gates. But this is why I am fully supportive of science-based targets. We are looking beyond our own impact. We are looking back into our own supply chain. It doesn't stop just because we achieve carbon neutrality.
Okay, there's a supplementary question from Dion Joubert. I think it's probably on the back of what you said about being carbon positive. Can you explain? He's asking for a definition of what you mean by that.
Yes, of course. We're at the point where we are trying to offset our emissions. We know exactly what our emissions profile is, and we know exactly what we generate over the year. We take the first step with the renewable energy, and then we end up buying carbon credits. I ought to say, clearly we're trying to buy carbon credits which also encourage the growth and the use of wind energy or renewable energy and enable communities to use it. But the next aspect is, can we install our own wind capacity? Can we, through partnering with our owners, GE Renewables, create sufficient additional new capacity that we can, in a sense, generate our own RECs and credits from those projects and ultimately assign them? It's rather complex because of the picture on European energy, on international energy generation, that you have to localize, for example, power purchase agreements and other things. But it's not beyond imagination that we could find ourselves actually being owners or responsible for actually producing RECs and credits which way exceed our own energy use and impact.
Okay, thank you. Matt Dickinson has a question, or actually 2 or 3 questions for you, Gabriel. First, he's asking to explain how BT is achieving 100% from renewables. Do you have your own sites, or do you have power purchase agreements, or are you purchasing certificates? And then he asks about offsets. Are you offsetting any energy use, and if so, how?
Okay, thank you. So in terms of where our renewables come from, we have a contract here in the UK with npower, who supplies us with renewables, which is certified from them. We also invest in PPAs, so about 16% of our renewables come from wind farms, and we indeed have solar at our research lab in Adastral Park. And we're also exploring how we might increase the amount of renewables that we get through PPAs. In terms of offsets, we so far have not invested in any offsets, which is not to say that we might not in future. For example, in challenging markets, and Mike will be familiar with this through RE100, where we're just not able to purchase renewable electricity from certified sources, and we might need to look at offsets in that. And I think also in reaching our net zero by 2045 target. So there are certain areas, I'm sure the challenges we all have around air travel, for example. So at the moment, we do not see an alternative for that. And so we will be looking for offsets for that.
So you're offsetting your business air travel, are you?
We're not at the moment, but we might, to get to net zero in 2045. That is something that we will need to look at, of course.
Okay, I've got a question from someone from Canada who's up quite early. Connie Karas asks if someone on the panel could speak about the availability of green or traditional finance to capital to finance the work that's required for net zero. Have you issued any green bonds or anything of that nature, Gabriel?
So far, no, we have not, but it's funny that is something that we're looking into, and I think is becoming more prevalent within the sector. I don't know, maybe somebody, Aris, more generally would like to comment on that.
I also have a specific comment. Sorry, Aris, you go ahead. I can just give a specific example. Please go ahead.
Sorry, that's fine. And again, I'm not an expert on sustainable finance. We have a sustainable finance center here at CISL. And I think that obviously you see a growth. There's a big shift in investor attitudes and preferences, and obviously some of the things that have been mentioned, like the role of the central banks. And some of the shareholder activism that we've seen from some of the big asset managers has helped. It's interesting to see, there's more and more green bonds around, they create a wonderful vehicle for companies to finance some of those activities. What I'm particularly encouraged is the kind of the financial institutions that are coming into the play, and kind of, yes, they have a sort of a specific and active and positive climate investment strategy, but also try to send the signals in the market about what won't work. So the announcement by the European Investment Bank on Friday that they will move into a more active climate investment strategy, and within the next 2 years they will stop financing coal, they'll eliminate fossil fuel financing from their project, or something along those lines. I think that's significant, almost as significant in terms of providing the signals, both at the government level but also at the business world, to say this is the direction. And yes, there are still various vehicles that companies can use, but increasingly finance is pointing towards green financing, more sustainable financing. And there's many wonderful examples from around the world of either green bonds or government-led initiatives or other types of pool financing that create that type of opportunity these days. So I think we've seen a lot in the last few months, and we'll see an acceleration of those types of announcements and decisions over the next 12-18 months or so.
Anyone else want to weigh in here, or?
Well, just to give a very quick example, we did actually use a green bond in Norwegian kroner as a way of buying ourselves out of a joint venture that was troubling in Brazil some years ago, prior to our acquisition. And these are increasingly attractive, very attractive instruments. I completely agree with Aris. We're seeing a complete change, a flight away from fossil energy investment into green energy, and it's happening both at a macro level, at macroeconomic level, at government level, but it's also happening where people are choosing something as simple as selecting only green energy in their own investment portfolios, and of course looking for a renewable energy supplier in their houses.
Okay, I'm going to have one. Oh, sorry. Is there someone else?
Sorry, Terry, it's Mike here. I apologize to interrupt you. I think just to add an extra piece here is to make the connection between the business commitments that we're seeing around the SBTs and the 100s campaigns and others and this point. And one of the things is that, for example, again, the commitments that are being made, and so strong forward commitments to buying renewables, is creating a very significant investment opportunity for the people who are then on the sort of buying into the production of that energy. So there's a sort of a multi-billion opportunity which is signalled by 100% commitment from these 200 plus companies that are in RE100. And this is another real piece that's worth exploring, is how we can grow the scale of those numbers doing that, so that in a sense gives greater confidence from the finance side that this is moving forward and that there are the opportunities to go for.
Terry, can I add one more comment when it comes to the role of businesses coming together, if we have time? What happened with the UK, sort of the letter to Theresa May, and kind of the decision of the UK government before the summer to move to take the decision to go for net zero. I think that was a wonderful example of how a group of companies, and there was a lot of pressure, and a lot of different type of institutions and groups signaled their intention to go to net zero. But one of the most impactful ones was that I think it was over 100 CEOs in the UK economy that said, you know what, we are behind you, and it makes commercial sense for businesses and the economy to move towards, and it makes sense for the UK as a leading economy to kind of do this. And I think that kind of demonstrates very practically what it means for businesses to come together and exhibit those signals, particularly in a very challenging political environment where no doubt there are all kinds of finance and economic pressures and conflicting priorities. And a lot of companies have signed up to science-based targets or other initiatives, but many haven't. And not, and it's that role of working, the collaboration and the engagement between business and government that raises the bar for everyone. And so even if we're not signing up to those types of ambitious initiatives in these individual companies, we raise the bar for everyone to at least get a little bit closer to that sort of net zero economy by 2050, because at the moment, we're still significantly overshooting that.
Okay, we've only got 5 minutes left. I just wanted to ask our panel if you'd like to summarize, if there are any points you'd like to make. in turn. Gabriel?
Yeah, I think one area that we didn't cover yet was around supply chains. And I think none of us should underestimate the purchasing power that we have through our supply chains and to change behavior. So we set up something called the BT Better Future Supplier Forum, which focused around driving innovation on sustainability and challenging our suppliers to start thinking about that. We also run something we call the Game Changing Challenge competition, which is a bit like a Dragon's Den for those of you that are familiar with that. It's basically we ask our suppliers to come in and pitch to a panel of BT experts around their latest green sustainability ideas, and then we select a winner and we work with that company to enable that solution. And we've also started introducing a new sustainability contract clause, whereby we request that the supplier reduce their carbon emissions over the term of the contract with BT, and that's a very powerful tool and also allow us to move up on the executive agenda. And finally, just around reporting to CDP, I think that's a very good starting point to engage with suppliers to get them to start thinking about climate action and carbon reduction.
That's great. Thank you, Aris. Any final thoughts?
Thank you, Terry. So I think we covered a lot of ground, and the one thing that kind of stands out for me is that for business models to realign, to decarbonize the economy, we need to get to very different ways of doing business that will require a high degree of transformation among current business models. So there's a role for all kinds of different instruments to get there. But I think the main objective is to decouple the success of the business model from emissions, and as much as possible, leave as little climate change we have to deal with and compensate for. And I think the same with other parts of the sustainability agenda. We have to create value and do things right in the process rather than coming back in the end and try to compensate, redistribute value and so on. And that is what's becoming very, very difficult at the moment, but there's definitely a lot of leadership out there, a lot of examples and a lot of good resources for organizations to look into and start thinking a little bit more aggressively about what it means for them.
Thank you very much. Christopher, any final thoughts?
I'd like to put the planet back at the front of the conversation. I'll be dead in 2050. My daughters will be middle-aged, and maybe there'll be grandchildren. They won't have any planet to occupy if we don't act sooner. So act now. We've got a clear guide on how to do it, a fantastic, clear 10-step guide to going carbon neutrality at www.lmwindpower.com. GoCarbonNeutral.com, and I think the many comments, the thoughtful insights that we've shared here today illustrate that business is highly compatible with a green economy. There is a green premium even if we can change attitudes, and the best way to do that, I think, is to talk to young people. I think the power of their arguments beats anything I have to say in the boardroom. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. Mike, your final thoughts, please.
Yeah, look, so let me close this by saying, I think what we've heard is that business matters. One more example, over half of the vehicles bought in Europe are bought for business fleets. Business makes a big contribution to this. Expectations are rising. The youth voice just mentioned by Christopher, I think this is, but not just youth, this is a stronger and unambiguous message that business is receiving. And then finally, which is a point about communications, but also about the importance of stretch targets, is the real thing we've noticed with our work over the last 5 years on the hundreds campaigns is the power and clarity of a 100% target, the unambiguous signal that can be made, which enables effective engagement with suppliers, with policymakers, and with the wider society. And I think finding the clarity of communication that business can have to demonstrate that they are taking seriously the expectations of wider society are going to be incredibly important.
That's fantastic, everyone. Thank you very much. I will now hand you back to Ed.
Thanks everyone for that. Thanks firstly to the panelists for the time today, and thank you all for listening. I hope you found the last hour or so enjoyable and useful, and stuff you can take back and then put into practice in your own work. Just a couple of notes. Everyone who signed up to today will receive the webinar recordings within the next week or so you can listen back at your leisure. And if you do have any questions that weren't answered, and there was a lot of engagement today, so do appreciate you putting in your questions. We're running the Responsible Business Summit Europe again next year. It's taking place on the 26th and 28th of May. So if you'd like to attend, visit events.ethicalcorp.com/RBS for the full speaker lineup and the agenda, and do get in touch if you'd like to learn more about the event as well. And lastly, thanks again for all your time, and have a great day.